Hi, you know that petroleum reservoir fluids have infinite components, right? And that's why we use the table of Katz and bodies. We use those average property components that are there with some properties that are not real for all kinds of reservoir fluids, but they work out very well in terms of average properties to model the fluid. But even so, if you deal with 20, 25, or even 30 components, right, for reservoir simulation, right? I mean, for production forecast, to deal with reservoir simulation for huge reservoirs, it's infeasible, right, from the computational effort point of view. It's impossible to deal with so many components. And that's why we should deal with lumping. We should have some lumping techniques to reduce the number of components in order to do reservoir simulations. Right? You're not forbidden to use 20 or 25 components. For 1D compositional grading calculations, well, it's a fast calculation. It's not hard to use 20 or 25 components, right? For some surface equipment design calculations, it's not so hard to use 20 or 25 components, right? But for reservoir simulation, right, for production forecast, it's infeasible. So we have to do some lumping technique, right, in order to reduce the number of components of your petroleum fluids. Let's talk a little more about that. Well, in the lumping technique that we are going to use here, right, we'll see that the extended model with more than 20 components is unfeasible in terms of computational time, as I told you, right? For the reservoir simulator, it's impossible, right? Maybe not for a 1D compositional grading calculations or for a surface equipment design, right? But for reservoir simulation, it's unfeasible, okay? That's why one needs to group some components in lumps, right? There are some criteria to perform such a lumping, right? Let's discuss some here, okay? For example, CO2, when in considerable amount, does not lump because of its representativeness on EOR and its peculiarities, right, comparing to hydrocarbons. It's a very important component for EOR, right? It's different from the hydrocarbons. So it may not lump. You should keep it alone, individual, all right? What about methane and ethane? They should not lump too, for they are normally in high concentration, right? Methane is the most abundant component in the reservoir fluid, right? They are also uncondensable, so they're very volatile, right? You should not lump them because they don't distribute, right? I mean, in process simulations, okay? At the high pressure in the reservoir, right, maybe right below the saturation point, they will distribute, of course, but not in process design, okay? But if you are to lump them, right, so depending on your machine's capacities, so I think you should leave methane with nitrogen, right, because nitrogen is in a very low concentration, so it won't make any difference. And C2 could stay with the other light components up to C5, the pentane, right? So you should use C2, C3, iso C4, NC4, iso C5, and NC5 in the same lump, in the same pseudo component, right? And then you have C6 to C12. A lumping like C6 to C12 represents very reasonably the naphtha, which is a refining fraction, right? It will make up the gasoline pool. And so I think it's important to make up a lump that will represent some refining fraction. And C6 to C12 represents very well the naphtha. Okay? C13 to C19 represents reasonably the kerosene. Right? So I think it's worthy to deal with this kind of lumping. Right? To take C6 to C12 and then C13 to C19. But there is no point on lumping the pseudo components of C20 plus. You remember that we have a split of the C20 plus fraction, right, into 2 or 3 quadratile points. You remember that, right? So There's no point on lumping them again, right? You should not do that. So you should keep those two components. So then we have CO2, right? And then you lump nitrogen with methane. Then you lump C2 to C5. Then you lump C6 to C12. Then you lump C13 to C19. And keep the quadrature components that respond for C20 plus, right? Exactly as they were generated. Okay? So this is the full composition you receive from, for example, the PVT report. Okay? So the colors alike here are the ones that are going to transfer right here when you lump the components. Okay? And the C20 plus will be replaced by the two quadrature points in this case. Right? These mole fractions will be calculated by the methodology. So you should not worry about it. Well, the problem is that you are responsible for the EoS fitting for this model, the lumped composition model, and this model, I mean the full composition model, because the reservoir engineers want to use this, and the flow assurance and surface equipment design engineers want to use this, and you are responsible for both. Don't forget about that. Okay? So if you enjoy all this discussion, and if you want to be responsible for giving the thermodynamic model for such a team of petroleum engineers, right? If you want to take this responsibility, right? If you just graduated and it's difficult to find a job, right? Come with us, right? The compositional grading course that we are launching in the next few months is a very important open door to the industry, right? So take the book. Take a first read at it and send your questions. I'll be happy to answer them. See you. Bye-bye.